Sandra Pupatello.
Thanks. I think on this we've got to stand on a really good record as an Ontario Liberal government. You know, Marianne Chambers was the first minister who created the bridging program. First time we had Ontario programs created that help people move into an occupation based on training they had in another country. Mike Cole was the minister who created that web portal so that overseas, before people landed on our shores, they could see where they could go and what they would find when they got here. Because so often they arrived with misinformation and then were terribly disappointed. Here's what we did. We were so good that we raised the expectation, and now we have to do better. So for those that we had a law that said if those schools and professions don't open their doors to foreign trained professionals, we're going to do it for them. These are the things we did as a government. We set that table for immigrants to come to Ontario. So even when they land in another province, they come here. We don't get the funding necessarily for them, but we need to care. And for that, we've increased funding. We've got to do more than that because they are still coming, thankfully, to Ontario more than any other place in Canada. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pupatello. Next up is Gerard Kennedy.
I think it's really important we dwell on this a bit. When we talk about potential, whether it's First Nation or new immigrants, all of our wealth, all of our well-being is connected to everybody being able to give the most. And while we have made progress, as Sandra said, both Eric and Charles know the federal government is not treating Ontario fairly. And we don't get economic immigrants that we can match up. And we aren't in a position, unfortunately, to track the job needs that we have and to tell people as much as we should through that portal. So there really has to be a defined advocacy on our part to say that we are going to track and make sure that people have an integration within a certain period of time, because there's a mishmash of programs there. It's something that I think the federal government has to be brought to account, and obviously we don't want to, in my view, do it over and over again in every jurisdiction. But if we're going to be the Liberal government in this country that's going to lead, we have to grasp this potential. We have to say that people's potential matters, maximizing the potential, and we got to drag kicking and screaming the federal government into recognition of that and give, if necessary, I guess, some of those powers to be able to adapt the situation for people that are coming in, because those hard targets are going to matter. Those families can't wait for the jurisdiction to be settled out.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Next is Eric Hoskins.
Well, I think just as it's important for us to recognize the progress that we've made as a government, the McGuinty government, over the last 9 years, it's also important to recognize that there is remarkable talent and expertise and experience and wisdom among our immigrant communities. And it's not a one-size-fits-all. There are many, many examples of immigrants who have come here, including recently, that are able to integrate very, very successfully. So we need to acknowledge that they are a resource for our province, and they're a resource to our economy as well. But there are some that are struggling more, and certainly, as was mentioned, are internationally trained professionals where we're not doing well enough to make sure that they have opportunity. You'll have a highly experienced individual that happened to get their training overseas. We're still stuck on this idea of Canadian experience as if world experience or experience in these other countries isn't important. We have a fairness commissioner, but she's unable to actually deal with specific grievances. So if I'm an internationally trained engineer and I feel that I've been wronged or I'm not treating fairly, I have no place to go. So we need to, and I would say just lastly this, probably the most important thing that we can do, and you're right that we need to continue to pressure the federal government. It hasn't been a good few years when I was minister, and of course when Charles was as well. We've lost $275 million that was committed through agreements to this province. But I think probably the most important thing we can do is ensure that this party, our government, and the public sector reflects what Ontario looks like today. And that reflects people from 140 plus different countries around the world speaking as many different languages. And if we set our target on that to make sure that the complexion of our government and our party and our public service reflects Ontario, I think then we actually make significant progress.
Thank you, Mr. Hoskins. Last to respond is Mr. Harinder Thakkar.
I guess the best way to really integrate immigrants into the society is to have them perform at their full potential. And I have 4 suggestions on that front. One is the biggest obstacle is recognition of credentials and qualifications. So we need to make sure that we can recognize their credentials in a way that their qualifications are recognized in this province, so is the experience. And it is really shameful when you see qualified doctors, when we have a shortage of doctors here actually driving taxis. That doesn't make any sense. The second is the bridge program. We have made quite a way ahead on that front, but in very few areas. We need to do more in several other areas so that we can do a 6-7 months bridge programs so their qualification gets recognized. And the third point is actually the internship program. We started that in the Ontario public sector, the internship program, that if you are qualified in certain areas and your qualification is not recognized, then we can give you a 6 months training in the OPS so that you can have a reference and you can get a job outside. And the last point I would like to make is when the new immigrants come to the country, sometimes the need is just little assistance. And that little assistance may be in giving them some bus passes so they can go and apply for jobs and actually go for interviews, because sometimes it's really very hard for them to, in the initial stages, to get settled in the country. I think so those are some of the things we must do in order to make sure that we integrate them into the society and we don't lose $6 billion of productivity in this province every year.
Thank you, Mr. Takar. We're going to open this question up for debate, and the first one to catch my eye was Glenn Murray.
I think we have to take poverty and health challenges in a really big way. 1 out of 4 people in my constituency, in the south half of my constituency, has diabetes. Right now, we wait till they get sick, they get out their OHIP card, and they go to a doctor, and it's expensive, and most of them end up unemployed. And the tie-in between unemployment and high levels of diabetes. What was the problem? There's no green groceries. When you got chocolate and junk food, and that's what your kids eat, you have obesity problems. So we have to take a comprehensive strategy to that. We've never done a health needs assessment. All of our assessments are once people get sick with diabetes. We have 360 not-for-profit organizations. How do I know that? Because I and my city councillors mapped them all out. And they're all duplicated. And we have no central, we're spending tons of money when we could. The children's mental health advocates got together in my community at the urging of our city councillors and myself, and they all merged. They're saving money. So while we don't have duplicate accountants, we don't have duplicate human resource functions, we have integrated, and more of those dollars are now going there. And as I said, because the communities are culturally different and they have different needs, the Tamil families and the Bangladeshi families wanted central meeting places where they could have a community kitchen. The people of British and French extraction who lived in the neighborhood who didn't have those large extended, who were living by themselves, needed odd jobs for homes and that. We started designing our own solutions. What we found is the money was starting to disappear for community-based decision-making. I think one of the best things we did was introduce local health integration networks. I think we have to democratize them. I think we have to put more power in their hands and less in the hands of hospital boards who still drive too much jobs. And I think we have to listen to people. And, you know, Bob Terrell used to say something to me when we were both mayors and we were fighting federal governments and stuff. You know, he also said there's a thing called subsidiarity. All decisions that you can make local should be made local first. And then you should have to justify for taking decision-making away from a community, a city, or a neighborhood. I think that's a very liberal idea, and I think we should practice it.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Next up is Charles Sousa and then Kathleen Wynne.
So part of that recommendation put forward to the federal government is to give Ontario a few more powers when it comes to selecting immigrants to come to this province, especially to fill the gap of needs that are existing. In Sudbury, for example, there's over 4,000 jobs in the mining sector. So we have the sector that exists and we're not able to attract and bring those individuals here to work. We need to increase our ratio from 50% economic class to 70%. That's one of the recommendations. We've asked to increase our level of provincial nominee programs from only 1,000 out of the 22,000 that exist across the country. We're asking for 5. And I'm asking, because Madame Mayor is very insistent, that we increase the level of Francophone members that are coming to Ontario from 0 to 5% at least, so that we can also appreciate the culture that exists in Ontario. You know, my father, I was fortunate he chose Canada. I was grateful Ontario accepted, and he came in 1953 when he landed at Pier 21. And he had this saying, he still says it today, there's room for everyone. There's room for everyone to compete and do business. There's room for everyone to learn. He's talking to the young people. And more importantly, he says, and he's 87, he says there's room for everyone to help each other. And that's what we are doing as Liberals, and that's what motivated me to run. This is critical. All of us working together is what's going to make our party and our province that much better.
Thank you, Mr. Sousa. Next up is Kathleen Wynne and then Gerard Kennedy.
Thanks. These are really definitional issues for us as Liberals, and I just want to comment on the interjurisdictional nature of this whole conversation. So in order for us to be able to tackle these issues of poverty reduction and helping immigrants to integrate into our communities, it takes all levels of government. So if it's adult education and training, we've got to work with the federal government and push the federal government on that, because there's a training component that's federal, and then there are settlement issues that are federal, but we have programs provincially. If it's the Aboriginal community that we're working with, we need to work with First Nations governments and with the federal government, because there's a very complicated, intricate network of interjurisdictional responsibilities there. There's a poverty issue that is right now being advanced by advocates. There were a couple of programs, the Community Startup Program and discretionary benefits, that were changed, that were reduced in our last budget. And in Hamilton and Peterborough and in Ottawa, I've had a couple of conversations with Mayor Watson. This is an issue that has hit municipalities in a way that we might not have expected. There were some unintended consequences in terms of the supports that people can get, and I think we need to look at that again. But those interjurisdictional issues are extremely important, and we need, as a government, to be able to work with all of the other levels of government in order to solve these very difficult issues that confront us.
Thank you, Ms. Wynne. Next up is Gerard Kennedy and then Eric Hoskins.
So what we have to do is set targets. We really have to set some responsibility on our part, and we've got to bring those other governments to the table. I mean, and roughly speaking, Drummond tells us, and the latest welfare report says it's going to cost a certain amount, about $340 million, to move people off of welfare, and we get $120 million saving for 2%. So we've got to be ambitious. If we want to be Liberals and we want to bring out people's potential, we've got to look at an 8 to 10% reduction in welfare in terms of the two programs in the next short while, because that's when it starts to save money for the province. And we've got to find a way, again, to make sure that the other levels of government get behind this, because we've heard a number of the real strategies there, but until somebody gets an outcome, we can't, for example, get at that 25% less that a new immigrant is earning. We can't get at the still traps that exist for single parents and so on, because those are some of the least vocal and least powerful groups that we've got. And that's where we have to set ourselves. As we lead Ontario fully out of the recession, people want to say we don't leave people behind. We don't, and they're not last in line either. So let's be Liberal, and let's look at some of the things that we have and have been talked about here tonight to set a hard target and tell Ontario, here's where we're going. Here's how we're going to bring people forward. And we've got at least 2 or 3 of the reports sitting in front of us, Drummond, the Lankin report, and so on, to do exactly that.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Next, Eric Hoskins, and then Sandra Cucatello.
Well, I think most people in the audience would agree that it's remarkable that in a country as rich as Canada, a province as rich as Ontario, there are so many of our citizens living in poverty, 400,000 children living in poverty today in this province alone. And so it's also, when a family of 4 on social assistance is receiving roughly $16,000 per year to live on for those 2 children and those 2 adults. It's difficult, I think, for any of us to imagine how you can possibly survive, let alone provide the necessities of life to your family at that type of level. And so I want to speak to 2 points from yesterday's From My Prescription for a Healthy Economy, which, as I mentioned, had a specific focus on poverty, and it speaks to an element of the Lankin report, the social assistance review that I've endorsed as a blueprint, that talks about probably the biggest roadblock that we've put in place, the biggest problem we face as a government, are the roadblocks that we put in front of those on social assistance who do want to work. And so we need to eliminate those roadblocks, and we need to invest more in programs that will help to make them, to get them meaningful, sustainable jobs. And I also talked about, in my plan yesterday, about a prescription drug plan for the working poor, because one of the biggest impediments, if you're on welfare, social assistance or ODSP, in actually moving off that into employment is due to the fact that you lose your benefits. You lose your dental plan, you lose your pharmacare plan. So by actually providing that income-tested drug plan for those, the working poor who can't afford to provide medicines for their children, you're also providing that ability for those who are on welfare, on social assistance, to get off welfare and become employable.
Thank you, Mr. Hoskins.